Hey, this is 2D, and I'm going to run you through a quick primer for the upcoming Magic the Gathering set, Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. So we're going to start off by running through the mechanics, talking about how they work, talking about what the set has to offer in general, and then we're going to talk about 5 fun places you could start off building some new decks. So the big theme of Ikoria is build your own monster. And I think that's best embodied in the new mechanic Mutate. So Mutate is essentially adding the abilities of one creature onto another creature. Look at Cloud Piercer, for example. So when you cast Cloud Piercer, you have two options. You can either cast it for its normal casting cost, and if you do that, it'll just enter the battlefield normally like any other creature would. Or you can pay its Mutate cost. So if you cast it for its Mutate cost, you target one of the non-human creatures you own on the battlefield, and you either put Cloud Piercer on top of that creature, or put that creature on top of Cloud Piercer. Whichever creature you choose to put on top is the main creature. That's where you get the creature's name, the creature's color, the creature's power and toughness. But the creature on top has all the text box abilities of the creatures underneath it. So this can lead to some really interesting combos. Like imagine you have Heliod the Suncrown on your battlefield as a creature, so you have its devotion turned on, and you mutate on this second creature and you put it below. Now you have Heliod the Suncrown, a 5/5 double striking indestructible god, and whenever it mutates, including this first time, you deal 4 damage to a target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and you gain 4 life, and that 4 life then triggers Heliod's natural ability. So there's all sorts of combos you can put together by kind of mashing together creatures' different abilities like this. So Mutate is a little confusing on its face, but I think in practice it'll be a little easier to follow. It's just essentially only pay attention to the creature that's on top, except for the text boxes. Use all the text boxes, but besides that, it's only the creature on top that matters. And one failsafe that's built into Mutate is that if you try to mutate onto a creature, and your opponent, let's say, like bounces that creature in response or kills it in response, whatever, the creature you were trying to mutate onto, it doesn't just disappear or go to the graveyard, it actually just enters the battlefield as a creature. So you don't get to mutate your monsters together, but at least you just basically naturally casted that creature, so that's okay. However, if your opponent does kill the creature after the mutation happens, then everything underneath it goes to the graveyard too, so that's something to keep in mind. And the other mechanic in Ikoria that really plays into the build your own monster theme is ability counters. So these counters are going to bestow keyword abilities onto your creatures. Luminous Broodmoth, for example, puts flying counters on your creature, and a creature with a flying counter on it has flying. And there's also counters like Trample counters, like Deathtouch counters, like First Strike, Double Strike counters, all the typical evergreen keyword abilities. And to help keep track of all these different kinds of counters, there will be punch-out counters included in this set. So little token cards with like a Trample counter with Trample written on it that you could punch out and then put on your creature. I think it's going to end up being a little confusing on paper if people kind of lose their punch-outs or whatever, but if people use the punch-outs, it should be mostly straightforward. In digital, it should be fine, though. The next mechanic in Ikoria is Companion. So Companion is kind of a complicated mechanic, but the easiest way to think about it is basically just Commander. So if you satisfy the restrictions that a creature has in its Companion ability, you can have one copy of that creature start the game outside the game, just like your Commander and Commander does, and then, just like your Commander, you're able to cast that Companion creature from outside the game. So the biggest difference between like a Companion and a Commander is when your Commander dies, it goes back to the command zone, right? So you can recast it as many times as you want, really. It never goes away forever. But that doesn't happen with a Companion. You just cast it from outside the game that one time, the first time, and then if it dies, it just goes to the graveyard like any other creature. And the Companion part is basically over after that. And one thing I've seen a lot of people asking is, do I need to like check my opponent's deck to make sure that they're satisfying the conditions if they have a Companion? Like if your opponent was playing Lutri, would you have to go through their deck and make sure none of the cards have the same name? And the answer is no. So there's no real way to get any advantage out of not following your Companion's restrictions. Like imagine you were playing against a Lutri, the Spellchaser deck, and all of a sudden they cast 2 ops. You just call a judge over, tell the judge that they're running an illegal deck, and they lose. So if you're playing against somebody with a Companion, all you have to really do is just make sure they're following the restrictions when they're playing. You don't really have to worry about what's in their deck. And finally, because the set just wasn't complex enough, they also have cycling in the set. So cycling is something that showed up in a ton of sets previous, but if you haven't seen it before, it's basically you just pay the cycling cost, and you're able to discard the card and draw a new card. Cycling looks pretty innocuous, but I think anybody who's played with it before will tell you it's a pretty deceptively powerful ability. It adds a lot of consistency to your deck, and any card that has cycling on it kind of has like a floor for how bad it can actually be, because at the worst case, you can just cycle it away for a new draw. So those are the 4 main mechanics of Ikoria. I think the set is like crazy complex. I'm kind of surprised. I know Wizards has been really adamant about like reducing the complexity of sets to try to make it, easier for new players to get into. And also, games can just kind of become a mess if there's too many complex things going on at once. So I'm really surprised by just how much the set has in it. The set has basically 4 mechanics in it, and 2 of those mechanics are Mutate and Companion, which are pretty complicated. But anyway, now we're going to talk about 5 tips / starting points that you can start from when you start building some new decks out of these sweet new cards from Ikoria. So number one, because of Mutate, creatures with powerful text boxes are something you're going to want to keep an eye on. Cards like Swiftblade Vindicator, although not Swiftblade Vindicator specifically, that's another thing you want to keep an eye on. Remember that you can't mutate humans. So Swiftblade Vindicator, as great as your text box is, you can't use this for mutation. But just imagine she isn't a human for a second. You could take one of those big 6/6 mutate creatures and just staple it on top of this, and just add Double Strike, Vigilance, Trample to an already huge beast. And consider the gods like Nylea. They all have Indestructible, which is really powerful to just be able to staple onto another, already powerful creature. Whether you're putting Nylea on top or putting it on bottom, you still get the Indestructible ability. Nylea also reduces the cost of creature spells, which includes the mutate cost, because that is technically casting a creature spell, even though you're not doing it the normal way. So building some kind of mutate deck around Nylea with this cost reduction in effect would be pretty interesting. Or you could just go full meme and make like the most confusing questing beast ever. Questing beast already has so many lines of text that nobody can ever remember what he does, but just imagine putting like 4 mutates on this thing. Your opponent might just like concede to avoid the headache, so that'd be pretty fun too. Just going for like maximum text boxes. So moving on to number 2, you want to remember the weird interaction between Deathtouch and Trample, and Deathtouch and First Strike or Double Strike. So between ways to give ability counters like Void Beckoner giving Deathtouch counters, or mutations giving abilities like mutating Brockos onto a creature with Deathtouch would also give it Trample. There's a lot of ways to get Deathtouch and Trample on a creature, or Deathtouch and First Strike on a creature, or Deathtouch and Double Strike on a creature. So Deathtouch interacts pretty weirdly with these other mechanics. So Deathtouch basically like mega charges Trample. Like say your opponent blocks with something with like 10 toughness. Well, you still only have to deal 1 point of damage to kill something with Deathtouch. So Deathtouch plus Trample means that 10 toughness blocker is actually only going to block 1 point of damage, and the rest of your power is going to go through right to your opponent's face. And Deathtouch combined with First Strike or Double Strike just basically means you can never lose a combat. Like it's going to take your opponent so many blockers to just trade with a Deathtouch Double Striker. So building a deck that would be basically like build your own ankle shanker would be really fun. So moving on to number 3, Luminous Broodmoth Shenanigans. So Luminous Broodmoth is a new mythic out of this set that has flying, and whenever a creature you control without flying dies, returns to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it. So obviously this is pretty good on its front. I mean, it's kind of like Wrath Protection. It lets you sacrifice a creature twice potentially, but there are some ways to actually go infinite with this. The most straightforward of which is Solemnity. Solemnity just stops players from putting counters on like anything. So if you have a Luminous Broodmoth out, a Solemnity out, and some kind of sacrifice outlet, you can basically just sacrifice the same creature over and over and over again, because when it returns to the battlefield, it won't have a flying counter on it. So Solemnity with Broodmoth would be fun to try in like Pioneer or Modern, but in Standard we have some stuff too, stuff like Charming Prince. So if we use Charming Prince to blink a creature that has a flying counter on it, it loses that counter, and then we can sacrifice it over again, and we can put together some sort of blink sacrifice deck that would be really fun. Using Broodmoth to like reuse Enter the Battlefield abilities, and then using Charming Prince to get the counters off them, and then sacrificing the Charming Prince and bringing it back with a counter, and yada yada. There's just a ton of ways you can get a lot of value with that. So I think maybe some sort of like Orzhov sacrifice deck with Luminous Broodmoth would be a really fun deck to build. And then for number 4, with Cycling, we can revisit Eldraine's second draw archetype. So if you remember back to Eldraine, this archetype was mostly built around cards like Improbable Alliance and Ironcrag Pyromancer. It was never like a super strong archetype, but it was a pretty fun budget archetype. And Cycling can really give it a shot in the arm. Cycling naturally fuels this. I mean, if you draw a card for your turn and then cycle something, you've just turned on the ability right there. In between like cheap cyclers and 1-mana cantrips like Opt, you should have enough low converted mana cost ways to draw cards that you can do it on your opponent's turn pretty consistently now too. And really just the fact that Cycling brings so much consistency to a deck, it means we can like dig deep for our Improbable Alliances, for our Ironcrag Pyromancer, to make sure we have our payoffs, because otherwise our deck isn't really doing anything. And just the power level of the deck has basically gone up because you have that floor of Cycling sort of like saving you from having bad draws. So yeah, once we see all the Cycling cards that come out of Ikoria, specifically in blue and red, it'd be really cool to revisit this archetype and see how much more powerful it gets. And then finally, my favorite potential deck that's going to come out of this set so far is Sneak Attack Lukka. So Lukka is a 5-mana planeswalker with a lot of text, but what matters here is his -2 ability. His -2 ability lets us exile a creature we control, then reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card with a higher converted mana cost, and then put that onto the battlefield. So we've had plenty of polymorph cards before, but the big thing about Lukka is that he specifically finds a creature with a higher converted mana cost. That means we can play like a lot of 1-mana mana dorks to ramp out our Lukka on like turn 3, and by keeping all the mana dorks and the utility creatures in our deck at like 1 mana, we can make sure that when we use Lukka's ability, we're going to hit something like a World Spire Worm as the only creature in our deck with a higher converted mana cost. And in Standard, you can kind of do the same thing with like 2 mana dorks and utility creatures and having some really big creatures to get off the top, maybe one of the new big beasties out of Ikoria. But primarily, I'm looking at this in the lens of like Pioneer, where I think Lukka may actually spawn a brand new deck around him. Maybe not like a tier 1 deck, but a very fun deck at least, that will very consistently spit out Worldspire Worms on turn 3. Yeah, so Ikoria is looking like a blast of a set. Like, I can't wait to start playing with these cards. Just a ton of fun, a lot of inventive designs and like really complex designs, so should be a ton of fun. But to address the 164,000 ton Kaiju in the room, there will be Godzilla alters in this set. I mean, they've got Godzilla, they've got Mecha Godzilla, they've got Baby Godzilla, they've got Godzilla's GF. Don't at me. They've got Godzilla's brother. They've got even Gigan, my boy Gigan. I grew up with a toy of this guy, now he gets to be my commander. How cool is that? I mean, just look at that idiot with his knife hands. He's so damn cool.